Welcome back. This time we're talking about Person of Interest, Season 5, Episode 7, QSO. This one picks up right after the cliffhanger of the previous episode, giving us a number of the week that's actually not a number, but is a mission that might just get our heroes a little closer to finding Shaw. Unlike the last several episodes where the storylines didn't necessarily connect to each other, they all do here. So for the recap, we're just going to go pretty much chronologically as the events unfold. Well, we begin to find that Fosco did indeed survive the demolition at the end of last episode, but he's in the hospital and is pretty upset with John, Finch and company because they're still continuing to leave him in the dark over just what he found. And on another good note, Bear's okay too. He's in the hospital room with Fosco looking over him, just like Finch and John are outside. They're determined to stay there and keep him safe just in case Samaritan tries to come after him, but Root gets sent on a mission by the machine and so she has to go off. We ultimately follow her through several missions, which adds some much needed comic relief to this episode. But one of the missions seems to be a little bit more important than the rest, in which she's posing as a ballerina and saves this Russian named Vasily, who works for the country's Ministry of Culture. For her part, however, Root still is wanting to find Shaw and is getting fed up with the machine sending her on these seemingly random missions rather than taking direct action to find Shaw. She goes as far as to try to communicate directly with the machine in public, which quickly draws the attention of Samaritan. The machine is able to help her escape and ultimately sends her on another mission, which leads her to this radio station where she's posing as the new producer for this radio host named Max, who hosts a sort of conspiracy theory AM radio show called Mysterious Transmissions. Meanwhile, back in her holding cell, Shaw is once again trying to escape, following a similar path that we saw in previous episodes. This time, however, she seems to know that she's in a simulation, and she's more fed up with the entire situation than anything else. So when Lambert returns and offers to take her on yet another field trip, she reluctantly goes, but doesn't put up too much of a fight. Back at the radio station, Max takes a call from a frequent caller named Warren Franco. And there's something about his tone that sort of sends up some alarm bells with Root, thinking that he might be a threat to Max. So she calls John and asks him to go investigate. She does this even though technically Max isn't a number, but she's still concerned, because she knows that the machine sent her here for a reason. During a commercial break, she asks Max about Warren, and he says that the two of them have been working on this mysterious code that Max recently discovered hiding inside radio broadcasts. Max tells her that he's about to announce his finding of this code on that night's broadcast. Later, Warren calls back and begins talking very erratically, and then proclaiming that he's about to kill himself. Root calls John, who's already on his way, and when he shows up, he finds that Warren's already dead of an apparent suicide. This is pretty weird because Warren's still talking to Max on the phone, responding to comments and talking about how he's about to kill himself. Root realizes that someone must have taken old recordings of Warren's calls and spliced them together so they can act like Warren's still alive, and therefore cover up his death as a suicide. As in previous episodes, this is about when our heroes realize that Samaritan has to be involved, and the code that Max and Warren have been investigating must be something that it's using, and wants to make sure that it doesn't go public. Before Root can figure out her next course of action, however, Max's voice starts talking on the radio by itself, proclaiming that he's going to join Warren in killing himself, even though Max is actually trying to fight with his audio board and regain control of his show. This forces Root to essentially break character and work to make sure that she and Max can get out of the building alive, because Samaritan agents are already in the building. While they're making their escape, Finch deduces that the code must be some kind of communication between Samaritan and its agents, which leads Root to realize that this must be why she was sent by the machine to this radio station, because they could possibly use this code and transmission to communicate with Shaw. Now, as usual, she makes the rash decision and locks Max in a closet and then goes back to attempt to communicate with Shaw, even though this puts both of them in grave danger. Well, speaking of Shaw, she and Lambert are still taking this field trip, which she believes is part of another simulation. He ultimately leads her to this scientific lab where this woman is working to resequence the genome of this long extinct animal in an attempt to bring it back to life, since it's been extinct for many, many years. Lambert tells her that according to Samaritan, that she'll eventually succeed, and in about 25 years this new animal will be back in the world, but it will eventually lead to some kind of ecological disaster, hurting farming and ultimately leading to thousands of deaths. In Samaritan's mind, of course, this means that she should be eliminated now before she can make the decisions that will ultimately lead, even accidentally, to many lives lost. And still thinking that it's a simulation and that she just basically wants to wake up, goes in and kills the scientist and goes, okay, can I wake up now? At the radio station, Root is able to find the device that's been infected with the machine's software and is able to start sending her own message through the transmissions. A few floors down, Max is about to get killed by some Samaritan agents when John shows up to save the day. Returning to Shaw, she finally realizes that her entire field trip was actually in the real world and not a simulation, meaning that she killed an innocent woman on behalf of Samaritan. Distraught, she manages to once again manhandle the doctor and steal a syringe from her, threatening to kill her by shoving it through her eye and into her brain. Which is a decidedly disturbing image if you think about it, but it gives us as the audience the knowledge to know that Shaw can kill with this syringe. Instead of harming the doctor, however, she steals her key card and shoves her out of the room, locking herself inside alone. That's when it becomes clear that, like in many of her simulations, she plans to escape by killing herself. And she's preparing to do just that when she begins to hear the code coming through the room's radio. Decoding the message, she reads 4-alarm fire, which she quickly realizes has to be from Root, meaning that they're still looking for her. This changes her entire outlook, and she allows the agents back into the room to recapture her. Meanwhile, Root, finished with sending her message, is caught by a Samaritan agent who's holding a gun on her. Instead of trying to escape, however, she attempts to make a deal with Samaritan itself, offering herself in exchange for it leaving Max alone, as well as taking her to wherever Shaw is being held. The machine appears to accept this deal, but then the power goes out and John shows up to disarm and knock out the agent. Root is pretty upset about this, but she's at least content with the idea that she was able to get the message out. They're getting ready to escape with Max, who they're going to have to give a new identity so he can live underground to remain safe, except Max is unwilling to go along with this. Realizing that they can't force him to go into hiding, Root comes up with the idea that if he promises to not talk about the code from now on, Samaritan might just leave him alone. The machine agrees with this assessment, so they end up leaving him there, going back to the subway station. Finch makes a stop off at the hospital, where Fosco is getting ready to be discharged. When Finch still refuses to read Fosco in on exactly what's going on, Fosco blows up, tells him that he's done with this entire situation, hands him his phone, and leaves. Meanwhile, Max resumes his broadcast, apologizing for all the chaos earlier, and then ends up going against his promise and starts talking about the code. It seems none of his listeners are terribly interested in the subject, but it's still enough to get Samaritan back on his case. And it turns out that the station's receptionist, who we met earlier, is actually a Samaritan agent, and she ends up spiking his coffee, leading to what I would imagine is an apparent heart attack. John, Finch, and Root, back at the subway station, listen to this happen live, and Finch confronts the machine about whether it knew this was going to happen. The machine responds that Max exercised his own free will, and that is what resulted in his death. It also notes that the primary mission, contacting Shaw, was a success. Neither of these answers sit well with Finch, and it starts a conversation between him, Root, and John about free will and just what that means. Root notes that Max chose to risk his life, and she wouldn't get in his way of doing that. Finch responds that a lie of omission is still a lie, and John, seemingly fed up of the entire thing, leaves. As the episode ends, we get 2 last-minute scenes. The first showing Shaw in her cell, secretly preparing what appears to be another escape attempt, this time for real. And then we get to see Root talking to Vasily that we met earlier in this episode, and he invites her to this national park in Russia. While talking to him, she's looking up information online, including a missile base that's nearby, leaving us to wonder just what exactly her next mission is. As usual, this episode left me with a lot to talk about. So let's start with Vasily, the Russian. This is the second episode in a row that had something to do with Russia after we met the Chechen rebels, even if it was in a simulation last episode. That leaves open the question whether that plot is real and not just part of Samaritan's imagination, and the fact that Root is going to investigate some kind of missile base in Russia, if there's some kind of connection there. Moving on to Shaw, or at least Root's mission to save her. Over the course of the episode, we discovered that Max isn't a traditional number, but instead sort of a collateral piece to the machine's mission to help Root communicate with Shaw. We also see earlier in the episode some insubordination on behalf of Root, who's getting fed up with the machine not helping more directly with trying to save Shaw. It was obvious at the time that it would be dangerous for the machine to communicate with Shaw out in the open, but it doesn't answer the question why the machine wasn't talking to Root earlier when they were in the subway car together. And as for my episode-to-episode counting of Samaritan agents, we find out that the receptionist at the radio station is agent number 1348. So these numbers are definitely on the rise. I will say it was a nice little bit of misdirection when she wasn't there earlier in the episode, when the Samaritan agents were setting up the voice spoofing laptop on the ground floor. I was actually wondering if they had killed her or not. But this leads to my next question posed by this episode, and that's just how many agents does Samaritan have that are willing to kill, especially just in cold blood, like she does at the end of this episode. We met Jeff Blackwell back in the Shot Seeker episode, and it was obvious that he didn't know what he had signed up for and was not willing to kill on behalf of a machine. So he wasn't a true believer. He was somebody who was told that he was doing good, but he's not an acolyte like it appears that a lot of these agents are, including this one apparently. Well, speaking of Samaritan, how creepy was it to hear it speak through the radio broadcast? I thought it was bad when we had to listen to him through the kid. This was even worse. And finally, that last argument between the machine, Finch, and Root, with a little helping of John, about free will. And that seemed to be the main crux of this episode, and really this season, because the machine's faith, or at least willingness to bow to human free will, is pretty much completely opposite to what Samaritan's doing. It wants to control humanity and basically save it from itself. The machine, however, is willing to, on both a macro level and on a micro level in the case of Max, to let humans make their own mistakes, even if it costs them their lives. But this episode does go to show that the machine, if given more power, is not going to try to control humanity like Samaritan is. The other parallel that comes out of this conversation is obviously the decision to allow Max to make the decision which puts his life at risk, while they're refusing to do the same with Fosco. Even after he nearly got himself killed over not knowing what he was getting himself into, they're still not reading him in, which ultimately leads to him pretty much leaving Team Machine, even though he never knew he was actually a member of Team Machine, or that there is a Team Machine. I thought it was curious, especially the look on John's face when he leaves, if he was actually realizing the hypocrisy of his and Finch's position on their argument with the machine and Root over Max, when they're keeping Fosco from making that same choice. You know, the whole keeping someone in the dark to protect them until it kills them, is a trope that I've seen in a lot of places. The one that really comes to mind the most prominently is the Dresden File books, where he's a number of his companions have nearly been killed, or in some cases killed, because he was trying to protect them by not telling them the whole truth. So that's about it for this episode. Of course, we have a third episode for this week, and I haven't even looked at the schedule yet to see how many we get next week. But until then, comment below on what you thought of this episode and what you thought of some of the questions that I posed, if you have an answer that you think might work. As always, you can subscribe to my channel, check out some of my other reviews, both for TV and movie, and until next time, watch out for Samaritan.